In one of the most tense and important scenes in The Godfather, we see the heads of the 5 families meet to make peace. The room exuded power, but also an air of uneasiness and tension. The men in the room had an immense presence in various different illegal activities, but throughout the films, we only get a deep dive into the Corleone crime family, leaving us to wonder who the other families truly were and how powerful they truly were. Their organizations were spread across the entirety of the country, barely being noticed, but behind closed doors, calling the shots. In this video, we will reveal the key moments that led to the meeting and a deeper dive into the heads of the 5 families. After Santino Corleone's death, the distraught Tom Hagen relayed the news to the Don. This is when Don Corleone knew he had to get back into the game, and when the underworld learned about his return, they frantically prepared for what they were sure was going to be a bloody retaliatory war from the Corleones. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. The Don called for a peace between the families instead. At first, the rest of the Mafia was highly suspicious of this move by Vito. Was he trying to prepare a trap? Was he trying to catch the other families off guard? But the Don wasn't, and to prove his truthfulness, he called for the services of a special family to confirm the meeting, the Bacchicchio family. Think of the Bacchicchio family as a type of mediator for other mob families. When families at war wanted to make peace and arrange a parley, the Bacchicchio Don was contacted. The Bacchicchios, who were once a ferocious branch of the Mafia in Sicily, had now become a symbol of peace in the America. If a negotiation was going to take place between families, the boss who called the meeting would pay the Bacchicchio a large fee for a hostage. This exchange ensured that as long as the negotiator returned from the meeting safely, the hostage would be let go. But if for some reason the meeting turned deadly, the hostage wouldn't be so lucky. Not only would the hostage be killed, but the Bacchicchio family would seek revenge on the family that was responsible for the violence. So when Vito called upon the Bacchicchios, there could be no question of treachery. The meeting was fully safe. The meeting took place in a small commercial bank, whose president was indebted to Don Corleone. The meeting was set for 10 a.m., and besides the 5 families, representatives of many other families across the country attended the meeting. The Dons brought their consiglieri as their aides, so there were relatively few young men in the conference room. Tom Hagen was the exception to this since he was neither old nor Sicilian, and was looked at by many as an object of curiosity. The first to arrive was Carlo Tremonti, who came from Florida. The Tremonti family earned its money from gambling, and was the one responsible for opening ties with Cuba and Batista, being supplied with gambling operations. Carlo received the nickname The Whale by swallowing up any and every business that came his way, owning almost every business in New Orleans and rural Louisiana. And by the 1940s, he owned a very luxurious Miami Beach hotel. The next to arrive was Don Joseph Zalucci from Detroit. The Zalucci family owned one of the horse racing tracks in the Detroit area and also controlled a good part of the gambling up there as well. Just like Don Corleone, Zalucci was a well-sophisticated man and also disapproved of the drug business. Joseph resided in a $100,000 house in a fashionable Grosse Pointe area within Detroit. Zalucci was also responsible for making Detroit the safest city, controlled by the families. There had been only 2 executions in the last 3 years. The next 2 Dons to arrive were from the West Coast, and they both traveled in the same car since they worked together. They were Anthony Molinari and Frank Falcone, the 2 youngest men at the meeting. Falcone controlled the movie unions and the gambling at many of the studios. He was distrusted by many of the Dons due to his involvement in the show business and his affiliation to Hollywood elites. Anthony Molinari controlled the waterfronts of San Francisco and was the king of the sports gambling world. He was known to possess the face of an impassive gambler who was known to be involved in dope smuggling across the Mexican border. Molinari also owned a seafood restaurant, and legend has it, he lost money from it due to giving such good value for the food. The aides for both of these men were not counselors, but bodyguards, but knew not to carry any firearms for this meeting. It was well known that these bodyguards knew karate, which amused the other Dons, but in no way scared them. And finally, the last to arrive were none other than the Dons of the 5 families. Tom Hagen was shocked by how much more imposing and impressive these men were to the out-of-towners. First, we have Anthony Strachey, who had control over the New Jersey area, running gambling operations and having a strong presence in the Democratic political machine. Strachey had a fleet of freight hauling trucks that made him a ton of money. On top of this, these trucks were so heavy they damaged the highways, which were ultimately fixed by his road-building firm. This was a pretty impressive scheme from Strachey, making him a wealthy man in the process. Due to his business being on the waterfront, it was impossible for him not to be in the dope smuggling traffic. Despite these rackets, the Strachey family was the weakest of the 5 families. Next to arrive was Attilio Cuneo, who was responsible for smuggling Italian immigrants from Canada and all upstate gambling. He also exercised veto power on state licensing of racing tracks. Cuneo had a front company that was a fleet of milk trucks that delivered across the city. From this, he earned the nickname the Milkman. Cuneo was a kind man and always carried a pocket full of sweets ready to give to one of his grandchildren. Don Cuneo was very good at hiding his activities and was one of the few Dons who had never been arrested. He was so good at hiding his illegal endeavors that he even served on the civic committees and was voted as Businessman of the Year for the state of New York. The second to last to show up was the deceiving Don Emilio Barzini. Barzini was the closest ally to the Tartaglia family and had his hand in every racket possible. He controlled some of the gambling in the Brooklyn and Queens area. He had some of the sports betting in the Bronx and Westchester. He dealt with women, he had strong arm systems, and was also involved in narcotics. He was one of the few smart men to be interested in Las Vegas and Reno. He was rumored to have a toehold in Wall Street, and his influence even reached Sicily. The Barzini crime family was the second most powerful family behind the Corleones, and thus, in the country. He was a man much like Don Vito Corleone, except more modern, more sophisticated, and more businesslike. He was never viewed as one of the old mustache Petes and exuded the confidence of a newer leader on the come-up. He possessed great personal force, and contrary to Vito, had no warmth to him. At this point in time, Barzini was perhaps the most respected of the men sitting at the table. The last to arrive was Don Philip Tartaglia, who was head of the Tartaglia family. Obviously, the room was tense, and Tartaglia was the one who directly challenged the Corleone power. He was held in slight contempt by the others. It was known that Philip was actually bullied around by Sollozzo and was the one responsible for all this uproar that affected the conduct of everyday business by the families. Tartaglia's main business was in prostitution, owning most of the nightclubs throughout the United States. To many of these men, his personality was unpleasant. He was known to be a whiner, always complaining about the costs and headaches of his family business. Once he entered, he and Vito exchanged a formal nod to each other. With Don Corleone being the center of attention, every man was studying him, trying to find a sign of weakness left by his defeat. But unbeknownst to them, it was all part of his grand scheme. After the arrival of Tartaglia, the men exchanged greetings and had drinks served. After another half hour, Vito sat down and the historic meeting began. The meeting itself lives in movie lore. And that's the video. What family history and business surprised you the most? Did you know the true story behind the meeting between the 5 families? Comment below if you want us to make an in-depth video about the meeting itself. Thanks for watching.